Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is David Woruka, and I'm a graphic designer here at Futuresoft. Welcome to today's episode of Lunch and Learn. So, Lunch and Learn is our bi-weekly webinar series where we get to, engage as a team and also with our clients and also potential clients, as industry thought leaders, analyzing several topics and giving insights on those topics. So today we're going to be looking at navigating brand evolution, and then we're going to be looking at a refresh versus a rebrand. I know most of us would have heard these terms severally and would have used them interchangeably as well. But I'm going to be highlighting today the key differences between what a brand refresh is and what a rebrand is. So I will start with the introduction. So this will be our compass for the day. So I'll start with an introduction into what brand evolution is, and then of course get to talk about the definition of brand refresh and a rebrand, and then going through how you know which one to choose and when it's necessary to go for which. And then we'll look at some case studies, and then we'll go through the process, to approach both a rebrand and a refresh, and we'll look at the pros and cons, and then we'll conclude for today. So, in course of my research, I stumbled upon this line on HubSpot, and it was very relevant to what I'm going to be talking today. So it says the brands that are not constantly evolving run the risk of becoming outdated or irrelevant. And I will show some examples in course of this training as to why that is. So let's get into the training properly. So first, when I talk about brand evolution, or when you hear the term brand evolution, so first you need to understand that it's the changes and adjustments made to a brand in its entire life cycle. And that change, you make to your brand in its life cycle from when that brand comes into existence to when it finally ends, if it ever does, as long as the word exists, if it ever does, every change you make, to that brand, it's considered the evolution of that brand. As long as the brand started from a point and, there are changes, were tweaks made to it in the process of its existence, then that means that brand has actually evolved. And when you're talking about the evolution of a brand, it involves adopting and developing, the brand over time to keep it relevant, to keep it contemporary, and to keep it aligned with evolving market conditions, customer preference. So you're keeping it relevant, you're keeping it contemporary. The goal of keeping it relevant and contemporary is to look at, you consider market conditions, how the market is evolving over time. The way we market today, it's not the same way we market just 10 years ago. It's not the way we did it 20 years ago, and it's not the way it was done maybe some 30, 40, 50 years ago. So the market conditions keep evolving. And then as well, this applies as well to your customer preferences as well. And technically, the customers are, I would say they primarily determine the market conditions, though not 100%, but they play a huge role in that. So you have to put the customers as well in mind while considering other aspects of the market conditions. So and when you're looking at the process, it involves, subtle changes like maybe updating specific elements in your brand or your communication. And when you're looking at the situation where the changes are very subtle, where the changes are not so obvious or not so drastic, where they are less, and where the brand stays, almost the same, but you make some advancement to it, you're considering that as a rebrand. When you give it a more modern and rejuvenated appearance, that's a rebrand. But then when you're looking at a point where you're going to basically transform the brand from where it starts from to what it is, it's an entire change. The change could be in direction, the change could be, heavily also on the visual as well. And then that's when you're beginning to consider what a rebrand is. But then I will do a detailed description of what a brand refresh is and what a rebrand is. But this just to give you an insight of what a brand evolution primarily is. So, and why is there a need for brands to evolve? So, like I talked about earlier on, your customers play a huge role. So, the market as well plays a huge role. Things are changing, the customers are continuously evolving. you know, giving some examples I just talked about. There was a time where we didn't have smartphones, and now we have smartphones. And beyond smartphones, we have smartwatches. And when you look at these changes, in technology, also when you look at changes in politics or maybe social changes, sometimes these changes why may not be reflected in every society. You look at, maybe changes globally, in terms of what happens in other aspects. You understand that the dynamics of human relationships when it comes to social change has actually changed over time. And then you have to understand the different ways we've evolved in terms of, our preferences as humans, as a people. And when you look at this, they are constantly changing. When you have a brand cannot be stagnant through these technological changes, through the social changes, political changes, and even climate changes. Your brand cannot afford to be static, during this, change over time. Because if your brand becomes static, it becomes obsolete, it becomes outdated, and then you risk the possibility of facing extension. And then also understand that when brands, evolve, they don't only just do it because, it's not only necessary, I think that's the best to put it. It's not only necessary to do it just so that you maintain your place in the market. When you want to evolve your brand, you also show your customers that you're joining with them. It shows that commitment that you're meeting their changing needs as well. And that's why you eventually go obsolete when you don't evolve as a brand, because when you don't evolve as a brand, then you eventually don't meet the need of your customers. And when you don't need to meet the needs of the customers, you don't have patronage. And when you don't have patronage, then you have no business basically, and that leads to the extinction of the brand. And it's important to understand that brands are focused on this sentiments, on the customers shifting in terms of their sentiments, and adapt this strategy to constantly stay relevant in the market. So let me just quickly give a peek, of a brand that not so long ago quickly evolved itself. Um, I'm sure most of us, if actually all of us, should be familiar with Dunkin'. Donuts, like it used to be called, though currently not available in Nigeria. We hope to see them soon. But one of the sometime in I think that was in 2019. So Dunkin' decided to drop the name Donuts from their name, and they decided to adapt the name just Dunkin' alone and say you should call them just Dunkin', and that was it. And why did they do this? Because they wanted to highlight, the diverse range of their beverages. So just before, Dunkin', I think shortly just before them, that was, I think, in 2017. Starbucks actually did something similar as well, where they try to reposition themselves, just beyond a brand that serves coffee and maybe sandwiches and other pastry snacks. They try to reposition themselves as a brand that actually offers a broader menu where they offer green tea and they offer more health conscious meals, and that's the same part Dunkin' eventually started taking, and they decided to drop the name Donuts from their name. And of course, still talking about how they demonstrate the sentiments of their customers. They've been running campaigns, and you use the tagline American runs on Dunkin'. And over time, of course, they've monitored the sentiments to find out the fact that the customers actually like that name, Dunkin'. So in the process of trying to readjust and reposition themselves in the market, of course, they have to go with that because that's already resonating, with the customer base. And so it's important to understand that, little tricks like this here and there over time will give the brand more relevance in the market and make it last longer. So let's look at what then, a refresh is and what a rebrand is in details. So when you talk about a brand refresh, so let me start with a quick analogy with the image I've made here. So I think that's like the easiest way to bring it more into like our consciousness of what a brand refresh is. So when you look at the image, we have three boards. So the one in the far back, not so obvious, but we have three boards present in that image. And then you notice that the one in front, why they are all similar colors, similar architecture, similar structure, the one in front has a tiny red flag above it. Now, that's just, a quick description of what a brand refresh is. you know. So if you assume that the second boat you could clearly see visibly is the brand, let's say 2 years ago, 3 years ago, four, five, six, depending on how long ago, and the one in front is the current state of the brand. That little red flag you've added on that board. That's what, a refresh is. You basically just made a tweak to the brand where, you're either updating, some making a subtle updates to your brand image. You're focusing on modernizing the brand. You're focusing on redefining, refining existing elements. The goal is to basically breathe new life into the brand without discarding the brand's core essence. So a lot of times, a brand refresh revolves around, elements, that I would say revolves more around your communication and around your visuals, things that actually interface with the customers, every now and then, things that can easily change, you know. I would like to make this joke. It's not really a joke though, but I'll just have to bring it in. We have a situation where, we have the battles of pronouns now, in certain countries in the world. And, for brands that are in existence in those places, trust me, you have to start looking at how you adjust your communication, how you start tweaking things to ensure you're inclusive in your communication. Because, if you don't start doing that, you'll start being tagged as a brand that is not inclusive. So making such minor tweaks, where your tone of voice, your visuals, you're adopting, you're changing to ensure that you make the brand more modern, make the brand actually, it gives it a new life where when it's presented before the customer, it fits in the market, So that's what the brand refresh is. Just basically the goal is to bring new life into the brand and to modernize it basically by refining it, and you don't have to change, the core aspects of your brand, like your mission, your vision, your values, your positioning, and maybe even your target audience. You can maybe create opportunities to extend your target audience, but you don't have to necessarily redefine your target audience, in a brand refresh. So in a brand refresh, the changes are often more subtle, and they're often things that can easily, be sensed and felt, by the customers, basically. And then, you can involve minor tweaks like the logo, typography, color palettes, other visual element. And like we said, the goal is to make it more modern, more contemporary. So refine it, give it new life without basically changing the brand at its core. So the brand stays the same, but you just make it more modern, you make it more refined, to suit the current market conditions and current preferences of your customers. And then I would give a very good example for this, and that's Google. So in 2015, Google actually changed their logo. So for those of you who are not as old as I am, if you remember some of the earliest, by the way, I'm not that old, just joking. If you remember some of the earliest versions of the logo, you realize that this is not the first time Google has actually made changes to the logo. At the point the logo had bevels in it, but there was a time where design started moving flats, where designers started taking out bevels and shadows, and they started exploring with flat design. And also within that point in time, Google adjusted and made adjustment to their logo as well. And they took out the bevels, took out the shadow, and made it flat. But then we find ourselves in an era where most people are beginning to lean more towards this sans serif font. That's what we designers call it, the font below here, which is more straight line. You don't have those pointers at the edge of the eyes and the G's. You just have everything moving smoothly, without evolving trend in design, which started from basically designs going flat and more minimalistic. Of course, Google, of course, I would say as one of the biggest tech company, of course, they have to make changes to their brand. But then also at the core of that is the fact that they consider the fact that people or their customers are beginning to use their devices, with different devices in their services, sorry, with different devices. And then, of course, they want a situation where their brand can express the same simplicity and delight you get from the Google homepage. The Google homepage is one of the most, if not the most minimalist, website you can find online. And I knew, I think that was the who took a dig at them when they started up. because when Google started up, most companies that offer search services will always add the search service with the blog to it. But Google, I think, just started primarily with just the search alone, and they took out the blog, and that was met with a lot of criticism. So, but the goal of that was to make the interface very simple so that it's accessible to the users. And they want that simplicity and that accessibility, to be expressed in every other device, in which, the users are going to start engaging with Google as technology trends evolve. And some of those platforms users can actually engage with the Google product or Google products in general, include your smartwatches, and also using voice prompts and voice command, in which some of these things were not there, a few years ago, at the rates, in which it is right now. You had voice commands and maybe super smart watches in extremely few circles and performing specific functions, as opposed to how you have it more common and rampant in regular day-to-day communication of, the mass, customer base of, of most brands right now. So, and in that process, when they actually recreated their logo to look more modern in terms of its appearance, they also extended the logo system, so they understood that the primary logo, the watermark Google they use, if you reduce this, to a certain size, it will not be responsive on the screen, so they created this G. This G is more responsive. If you have mobile devices, when you click, on your Google app, you see the G by the left. It's easy as well to fit in as an icon for the mobile app itself, and also serve effectively as a favicon. And then as well, when you give voice prompt or command to Google, you notice these dots as well. And then when you have files loading in Google, you notice these dots as well. So, and this as well shows the different interactivity and the different touch points, them trying to create that experience. I know they ran a particular this image here. It's not a video I can play, but they ran an ad where, using, I think, this particular image where a voice prompt was given, and you could see how these dots come to life and how they come to life and how they start to interact, to give the command, to process the command, the user has imputed, and how when the command was eventually processed, how this animated and moved back into the Google logo. And that was amazing. So those interactions and trying to create the experience as well and accessibility for the user to understand that if you want to communicate with us now via your voice, via, smaller screen devices like your smartwatch, we've got you covered. So that was one of the reasons, they wanted to actually carry out this refresh. So they didn't just want to carry out this refresh just solely for the purpose of being modern in terms of look and feel, but also to be modern in terms of accessibility and functionality as well. And you can see, if you visit the Google Instagram page, primarily Life at Google, you see how they've utilized, their colors and their brand, in office spaces around the world. And it's pretty much amazing. So, and then we now go into a rebrand. So a rebrand, on the other hand, is a significant shift in how your brand looks, how it acts, and how it presents itself. So it's not only about altering your visual elements in this time or other things, the user can feel, maybe anything they can feel in terms of the sensory part of your brand. It's not just about altering those parts or updating them or improving the interactivity. In this aspect, it's a significant shift in how your brand looks, how it acts, and how it presents itself. So going beyond the sensory aspects of your brand, it involves what your company values are, what your mission is, what your vision is, and even how you position yourself in the market. And sometimes in every brand, there's even a change of name. And I'll be giving a quick example that actually highlights that. So most often rebrands are undertaken primarily when there is, changes in terms of maybe there's a merger or an acquisition of the company, or maybe there's a change in direction. The change in direction could be change in terms of redefining their mission and vision. Why the products, they're out, they're selling might still be the same. It might really be about finding their voice, really finding themselves to the point where, maybe what they focused on initially may not really be expressing or capturing the brand as effective as it should be. And I'll give an example of that later on in this training using Airbnb. And then away from that as well, it could be as you or maybe a brand trying to expand itself globally, and the way it has actually branded itself, it may not be suitable, for the new market it's entering. It could be the company also expanding its services and growing into something else. And it's a process that requires, careful planning, research, and of course, creative execution to execute, because when you want to do a rebrand, it takes, carefulness to achieve it so that you don't mess it up eventually. So a good example of a rebrand that is easy to relate is Taxify. So I think that was in 2019. They told us Taxify is now Bolt. So why, the Taxify rebranded themselves to Bolt from Taxify. So there were several reasons, but one of the first things they stated was the fact that they've grown into a much more broader transportation platform, providing ride-hailing services, then with cars and then motorbikes as well as scooter sharing. So they went just beyond, aggregating of taxis. They went into providing services for motorbikes and scooter sharing. When they did this rebrand, the scooter sharing services and their bike services are not available in Nigeria at the moment, but in other countries in Europe, they have these services available. And understanding that they are beginning to shift, they are beginning to expand into the broader aspects of transportation, just beyond, taxi aggregation, and I guess also the ride hailing. They wanted a situation where they needed a name that captured, their new vision, their new direction. And then some other things to note about this is the fact that over time, they've just even grown beyond, car sharing services and ride hailing and scooter sharing and all of that. They now, sort of, I don't know if I'll classify this as an e-commerce, but I will look at it from the angle of the same aspect of delivering. They have a marketplace where and they also have the Bolt Food, where a lot of restaurants, are using these services. So they also do delivery. They also help. They don't just move people from one place to another. They help move goods as well, or food from one place to another. They also do the Bolt Drive, which also I don't think it's currently available in Nigeria. But the Bolt Drive is like a car rental service. It's the same way you dictate, your Bolt ride when you order your Bolt ride via the app. That's where you find, the Bolt Drive. They have the free parking spaces where you can actually, park the ride, and you can dictate one around the environment, and you use your code to unlock it, and then you use the Bolt Drive, you drive yourself, move around the city, and then when you get to your location, you find a free parking space designated for such parking, for free parking purposes, and you leave it there, and then someone else can discover the ride. So they have that already in operation, and I think that's still scaling at the moment. I think they just got some investment recently on that aspect. So, but that move, into expanding just beyond, offering, what you primarily call taxi services, wanted them to actually, they wanted to reflect that in their name. And also they adopted the name Bolt, because it also signifies speed. And it also, I guess also, I would say, I guess, though they talked about, moving green. I don't know if they talked about it in terms of the name or it was just on the color. But if you understand electricity, the whole lightning and all of that is still associated with Bolt. So it's still in line as well. But for the color green, they have adopted it because, the Bolts, was what they named their scooters originally. And those scooters, were electric powered, and them showing that they want to also move from the combustion engine and they want to go green. They're trying to be a brand that is more futures fit. They reflected that as well in their color. So you can see there's a whole lot of reasons why they decide to change the name from Taxify and to Bolt, and a lot of ideas they wanted to capture. And you see how these are some of the benefits of a rebrand, when you're trying to really give yourself a fresh start and capture new ideas with the brand you're trying to recreate from the original brand or evolve from the original brand. So this is a very good example of a rebrand. And then I will just highlight the key differences side by side between a rebrand and a refresh. So for a refresh, when you talk about brand evolution, a refresh is a more focused, effort within that. where it involves updating specific elements of the brand identity and communication to give it a modern and rejuvenated appearance while retaining its core essence. Whereas a rebrand, on the other hand, is a more comprehensive, dramatic transformation of the brand's identity, purpose, and positioning, you see. So it goes beyond the refresh. It involves significant departure from the existing brand image. And the example between Google and Taxify and current now both have gives this clear picture. You can see how Google was just basically modernized, but Google is still the same, trying to organize the world's information for you where you can access. That has not changed. They keep doing that. Whereas you see Bolt as a brand has expanded just beyond a ride-hailing service or taxi aggregation into a much more broader transportation company, and even now into logistics, and I think that gives clarity on what a refresh is and what a rebrand is, and usually the objective of a refresh is to, like I've said before, to enhance the brand's appeal, making it feel more relevant and appealing to the current audiences without dramatically or fundamentally altering its essence. I talked about the interactivity of the elements Google has imputed in their new identity system, to make it more appealing and more, I would say, accessible or interactive with their customers. On the other hand, a rebrand objective is often undertaken to address significant change, such as a merger acquisition or a change in direction, which, like I pointed out, when you're moving from one point to another, going broader into your industry, a rebrand can help you capture that, better. And then in terms of the changes, we've seen that visually, a brand refresh typically includes the changes in the visual, copy style, tweaks in collateral to breathe new life into the brand without redefining it. A rebrand, on the other hand, include the brand name, the visual identity, messaging, product offerings, and even completely, rethinking the brand's position in our target audience. So how do you know when to choose a rebrand and when to choose a refresh? So I've highlighted some points here. So I don't know if these points are 100% exhaustive, but these ones I'm 100% sure that I will recommend you make changes, to your brand when, you're faced with these particular situations. These are the ones I am 100% sure I'll recommend any day, anytime. So one is the evolving market trends. So when you talk about market trends, I've given a very good example with Google, and like I stated here as an example, a brand updating extending its logo for more responsive application and to appear more modern, to be more interactive, more responsive. The case of Google can explain that in details. So but brands should consider refresh to align with market trends and consumer preferences, updating communication, visual elements, your logo, color, image, style, to stay current. So when market trends are evolving, that's a good time to refresh. It's not necessarily a good time to rebrand. Just because the market trends are evolving doesn't mean you have to rebrand. So you have to understand that, it's a good opportunity to refresh. So if you're an organization currently where you're beginning to feel the need to include sustainability in your communication because of that's being talked about much more. You don't necessarily need a rebrand to include that into your branding. You can just easily include that into your marketing communication. You can extend your brand color palette if necessary, to ensure you capture that. You can make minor tweaks, and of course, not just doing that, but also adopting sustainability practices as well. Very important. You must live your brand truth. So as market trends evolve, you can just refresh your brand to suit it. You don't have to redefine your business. You don't have to make, extreme changes like I've pointed out in the case of Bolt. You can just make subtle changes to ensure that your brand still fits in with the time. And then also if your brand is stagnated, a refresh can help re-energize it and also appeal, maybe and attract customers by introducing fresh elements as well without completely doing that. So an example would be, an established software company launching a new user-friendly interface and updating its marketing campaigns to attract younger demographic, and examples I would give, for those of you who would have paid attention, sometime this year, I don't know if that was even this year or last year, if you noticed YouTube, when you stream on YouTube, the interface changed. Your subscribe button now has a black background. It's very much obvious right now. Like, you can't miss that subscribe button when you're streaming on YouTube, especially on desktop. you can't miss that subscribe button. So another aspect when you consider a refresh is when brands are celebrating milestones. So brands will often conduct a refresh on their identity, and special campaigns when celebrating significant milestones or anniversary. And of course, this often generates excitement and reinforces the brand's longevity. You know, um, an example could be a famous automotive manufacturer releasing maybe a limited edition model and updating its logo, for its maybe centennial celebration. And we see this a lot, especially in the auto industry. They make tweaks every here and now, and then they make minor changes. Rolls-Royce basically updated it or refreshed its logo system this year. And the spirit of ecstasy, the Rolls-Royce motor car fonts, the RR logo, they refreshed that just a few months ago. And the changes are so very subtle, so minor where if you're not shown, you'll not actually really, pick it out instantly. So they do this every now and then, and I think in this case, they did some tweaks in terms of the color, or maybe made the colors richer. They projected that purple more this time around, and that was done by Pentagram. So you can look that up and see, how that was done as well. So and then when it comes to a rebrand, so the two are basically highlighted when it comes to a rebrand is, when you have a major shift in business strategy, like I talked about the case of both. When a company undergoes a substantial change in its business strategy, maybe such as entering a new market or shifting its focus, a rebrand may be necessary to showcase the company's new direction. So when you're, and also this could also be in terms of how you've also say interpreted and expressed your brand. If where you've communicated a brand has not actually captured the essence of your brand as well, this is another opportunity in terms of a shift in your messaging, in your positioning, in your mission, in your vision, in your values. That could also help in terms of repositioning the brand as well. Then we talk about a merger and acquisition. So if a company is acquired by another or there's a merger, having both companies in a unified brand identity can always help eliminate any confusion, the customers may have. And of course, it will present a more cohesive brand to the customers. An example would be two banks merging. They may undergo a rebrand to create a new one that reflects combined strengths of both. We all knew when Access Bank and Diamond merged. I don't know if it was an acquisition or a merger, but we could see the reflection of how elements from Diamond Banks and elements of Access Banks are now bunched into one. But let's leave the matter of execution of that for another day. But that's just an example, of what an acquisition could do. And I know at some point we were working on UPDC, that was in 2020, and in the process of trying to revamp the brand, they were acquired by that was what's this company again? I've forgotten the company that acquired them, but eventually it actually was reflected as well, the visuals and in the colors and everything, he actually did for them. And so that's just some of the examples when it comes to merger and acquisition. So for my own take, these are two major areas I would advise for a rebrand, because a rebrand is often more technical, and these are cases where I would say you go for a rebrand as an organization, except when you're starting a brand from scratch. But when you're starting a brand from scratch, then you don't bother about the refresh because there's no brand in the first place. So you start that brand all over. Then basically that's just what is branding. Basically, that's will not be categorized as an evolution of the brand. That's just branding, primarily from scratch. And then one other thing I point out is the fact that in also talking about brand refresh, there are other aspects. You can actually make changes or advance on your brand. They may not be front facing. Talking about, you have an existing brand, but you don't have proper brand guides or proper brand system defined. You could also, include that and ensure you have a proper system, well documented and defined. So you might have a very good looking brand, in terms of how people are looking at your color, your visuals might be nice, but you may not have proper documentation of your typography, of your color system, the color ratio and how to use each and every one of that, the brand elements, your brand patterns, your colors, your image styles properly documented as well. So if you don't have those things in place as well, you don't necessarily need a rebrand to have those things in place. If your brand already has a very good structure in terms of its appearance, that can actually be done and properly defined as well. And that can still be categorized as a brand evolution or refresh, but that's, it's really more around brand management, as the brand is ongoing. So let's look at some case studies. So I talked about, a rebrand not always being the company necessarily maybe expanding its service or changing its service, or maybe even changing its name. And Airbnb is a very good example of that. So in 2014, Airbnb shifted their narrative from, a place to stay and, maybe talking about the insurance they give to to their potential customers, and then talking about bookings, they focused more on those things, but in 2014, they realized that wasn't working for them. So they had to shift from all of that functional aspect, that they focused the brand on, to shift to warmth and welcome, which is what the brand essence actually is. It wasn't really about housing. And they worked with a UK studio called Design Studio for this project, and in the process of research, getting customer feedback, looking at how the brand started, by the founders, they realized that, it's not really about the place, this place is technically, at all, according to the design studio, but that belonging to the world and over was Airbnb's truth and its differentiator. So that was what was key in terms of the Airbnb brand. And that has not been effectively communicated properly. The logo they had at that time, from what I learned, was designed by one of the CEOs, and it was just slapped on. It wasn't thought through. They had about a week to come up with it, but then, having that knowledge of, or that newfound essence of the brand, from actually carrying out research from the customers and actually carrying out, internal research of its services and what it really wanted to achieve, they realized that belong anywhere not only define the brand, but it also serves as a powerful differentiator from the business itself. And that's when they adapted that mission of belonging anywhere in the world. And the success of that, of course, when it was rebranded, the Airbnb brand trended on Twitter. It earned several awards as well. And it also helped play the role in terms of Airbnb valuation of 25 billion, just, and in 4 years after that, they grew significantly above their competitors. So you can still read more about the Airbnb, brand. Maybe I can eventually share an article if you're interested in that. Just reach out to me. I'll give you links that will help give you more light and details about the Airbnb rebrand. And then you talk about the case of a refresh. I will give another example here again with MasterCard. So in 2019, MasterCard updated, their logo icon, and, the drive was basically to make the brand more dynamic, again, in the digital age, So the reason for the redesign is to create more digital adaptability, simplicity, and clarity, to effectively communicate the brand. So they kept streamlining the brand, reducing all the excess element to the point where they used the MasterCard alone with just the two circles, and basically the reason why they went for this, why they understand that, it was actually, along the risky line. They understand that this is a mark that has been recognized globally. They conducted their research properly to ensure that they have that information appropriately, and that they understand this is a mark that can be recognized by most users. And according to the CFO, in a conversation with Forbes magazine, he says, of course, the feedback they are getting from, the global market, is extremely positive, and they're feeling good about what they do. And there was a campaign I shared in one of my previous training, where they were able to communicate this visual element very effectively. And that campaign, when you look at the visuals, it's extremely powerful. And the campaign as well was also success. So if you need to view that as well, you can refer to the training I did on brand consistency on our YouTube page. So that's where you find that. And then, the process of rebranding and refreshing a lot of times doesn't often go well. And a good case is that of Gap. In 2019, they tried to change, their logo. They tried to modernize it. So this is what the logo originally looked like, and they had to do this, and one of the things was the fact that they clearly didn't, consult their customer base. They clearly didn't really look into the market research to really check to see if this was actually essential or very important. So which is why, It's important not to just venture into these things for the purpose of, doing it for you as a brand. It's important to understand, like I said initially, you consider the market trends, the changes in the market, and you also consider your customer preferences. So when they did this back in 2010, they got very strong backlash. They got very strong backlash from their customer base, and then it was on Facebook. And just within a week of releasing the new logo, they had to revert back, to the previous logo. And that's not a very good attempt at trying to modernize the brand. On the other hand, it would definitely have affected their finances within that period as well. So it's important to take the appropriate step. But currently, they've taken out the blue background and they've just left the text alone. So this is what they currently have on their website, which is basically not far from this. So to me, technically, it's still the same logo and it's still the sort of change, we talked about. Maybe Dave would have looked at this from a different perspective this time to ensure that, such disaster won't occur again. But then again, sometimes making refresh your brand does not necessarily mean maybe touching your logos and maybe your color palette, your photography style, your design style. You could make changes to that and you still retain every other element, of your brand, and it will still be helpful. So I brought this last because I wanted to point the processes, of a rebrand and a refresh and why it's important to pay attention to each of these processes. So, and we're going to be looking at both together, so they both have similarities in terms of the process you go through to execute them. And there are key areas where they are now different in terms of the execution of a rebrand and a refresh. So for a refresh and a rebrand, you have to do an assessment and a research. I just talked about the case of Gap, which if I believe they didn't really carry out a proper research in terms of how their customer base will respond to that, which is one of the things you do. So, but you start with, of course, conducting a comprehensive brand audit to assess the current state of the brand. So you assess the current state of the brand if it's really fitting the purpose. The case of Google I talked about, when I read through the case studies, they talked about how, in lower broadband, their logo wouldn't appear in the quality it should appear. And those are some of the things they had to address, so they had a real need to do this just beyond trying to be modern. They had functional purposes as well why this had to be done. And so you have to consider the state of the brand to see if there is really a need for this. And of course, you have to gather feedback from your customers, like I mentioned, your employees, and other key stakeholders to understand the perception of the current brand. If Gap had really done a pool, rather than just launching something, if when they had the draft of the logo and they just decide to say let's conduct a quick poll, and they throw it out there, which would you prefer? They would have easily just gotten the feedback to get an idea to see, or even without spending, they would have really easily asked, do you guys think we should update our logo or just do it some other way? And they could have gotten a quick feedback, if that was necessary or not. So you gather research from your customer base, from your employees and other key stakeholders to understand their perception of the brand, because it's not really about you as the organization. It's really about the market you're serving. Of course, you research your competitors and the market trends to identify the opportunities, and of course, possible threats and challenges as well. And then clearly you define the goals and objectives of the rebrand or the refresh, if it's to attract a new audience, if it's repositioning the brand, differentiation from competitors, or updating its visual identity. So these two processes you have to go when you want to conduct a refresh or a rebrand. And then this is where you start having, the similarities between both of them. So for a refresh, you have to revisit your brand strategy to ensure that the refresh aligns with your brand strategy. So you can't conduct a brand refresh that goes away from your brand strategy. You conduct a brand refresh that goes away from your brand strategy, then you have a chaotic brand. The brand will not be cohesive, and then you just create confusion. So if you find yourself where you're attempting to make changes to your brand and where the changes you want to make are beginning to shift away from what the brand strategy originally is, then that means you're conducting a rebrand. And when you're conducting a rebrand, while you may not necessarily change everything on your brand strategy, you have to definitely make significant change in your brand strategy. So if it's necessary, you have to craft a new mission, vision, values, rethink your targeting, your market, your target audience, your positioning, and so forth. So the difference between a rebrand and a refresh in this level is the refresh doesn't primarily touch, the brand strategy. If it comes into the brand strategy, it does touch the brand strategy, minor things like your tone of voice, things that are still sensory, things that in a broader scale can still be considered as part of the identity, and maybe a minor tweak or extension of your audience, which are not so significant in terms of its change. But in a rebrand, then those changes are going to be more drastic because the brand is actually shifting, from the way it acts and the way it presents itself. Then when it comes to the identity, you update the brand logo in terms of a refresh, like I showed you Google. They just only updated the logos, made minor tweaks to some of the colors. They lightened some of the colors up. I think the red, the yellow, and the blue, I think those are the ones they brightened up a bit. And then they made changes to the phone and extended the lockup system. So that was what they did. They didn't have to redesign a new logo from scratch. They just updated what they currently have that is still very recognizable. So you make tweaks to the color. Like I said, they make some minor color adjustments, but still retain most of the appearance in terms of how it looks. And then, of course, you ensure the refreshed new look, enhance the appeal of the brand, and resonates with the target audience. I just pointed out the case of Gap. So you have to ensure this are checked. Then when it comes to rebrand, you have to redesign your visual identity. I gave the case of Airbnb. I gave the case of both and from 35 to both. So you could see the clear change in terms of the logo. You could see the clear change in terms of the color. So in a rebrand, it's a total redesign of the visual identity, including the logo, the color scheme, typography, and any other visual elements. Now, in some cases, you may not necessarily change your colors, totally, and you may not even necessarily redesign your logo in most cases. Sorry, please. You may not necessarily redesign your colors in most cases. In the case of a rebrand, sometimes you can also find yourself in a position where the change may not really reflect your logo, but the change may actually be reflective in your mission, in your vision, in your positioning. The name might be constant. Every other thing might still be the same, but the direction of the brand is changing. And of course, eventually that will reflect in your communications. So in terms of the visual, it can stay the same. But in terms of how the brand is beginning to communicate, there will be significant changes to it as well. Then, of course, same thing, you ensure that the new visual identity reflects the new brand strategy and resonates with the target audience. So very important. So still some dissimilarities between both of them here as well is the fact that, for a refresh, when you're looking at the content and messaging, you're basically going to develop new sets of content that actually communicates the purpose of the refresh, whereas in a rebrand, you're going to be crafting an entirely new messaging for the brand. And then when it comes to collateral, the updates, for brand collateral, you could be making an update, on your website to capture the new look and feel, so, basically you could make, some significant changes to your homepage, not necessarily maybe changing the entire layout, but updating colors where needed, and maybe making one or two changes where needed. You may not necessarily need to update the website content and update your copies. So the change is in your website and your collateral on that note it's less is I would say it's minimal. It's basically an update. It's more or less like an edit. And as well, other digital ad sets as well, print, collateral, merchandise. If it's a case where you've just made a tweak to the logo and the colors are the same, you can just edit and replace those elements. So you don't have to change entire layouts. You don't have to change entire image systems as well. And if it's a case where you maybe updated images, you can also just make changes and edit to the new image style you want to reflect, and then you put that as well out there. You don't have to make drastic changes. So the impact is less minimal in terms of your brand collateral. Whereas when it comes to a rebrand, you're basically starting afresh. If you're going to be moving in a new direction, for the case of both, I mean, you're going to be talking about different things, talking about your new services. And, if you're beginning to talk about you going green, moving away from the combustion engine, you have to capture all of that. So there will be an entire content update. For the case of both, you have to even buy a new domain name. So that's basically starting from scratch. And that's one key difference as well in that aspect. And then the next set, are situations where they both align again, which is employee training and alignment. So it's important that when you conduct a brand, refresh or a rebrand, you conduct the training session, workshops to ensure that your team understands what they're dealing with, understand the new goals, you train them on brand guidelines and maybe the new communication style where necessary. And then, of course, there has to be the stakeholder communication. For both cases, you have to develop a communication plan to announce the new, brands to customers, to clients, partners, and all of that. So I think there was one video Google did when they changed their logo. I think then when you logged onto the website, the old logo appeared, and then a hand came, wiped it off, and then the new one appeared, and then they wrote some little things about it, letting you know that they are changing. When Fort Oil rebranded to Adobe PLC, on their social media, they converted the Fort Oil logo there into a butterfly, and they mimicked the butterfly because the logo actually looked, that way, and it looked like it was flying. And for some weeks, they kept posting stuff relating to that, saying we're evolving, and eventually, they launched, the Adobe PLC, and at least that's one of the channels I spotted them, announcing their rebrand. Or you could use various channels, such as, press releases, traditional media, social media, email newsletters, and events as well to spread the word. Some organizations organize very, elaborate events to announce, their rebrand. I think when NMPC announced their rebrand, they actually organize a huge event for that, and they have a session where they do the new logo review and all of that. And then they get to talk about the new purpose of the brand, where the brand is headed, why they made this decision, and then they do a lot of communication. This is to ensure that your stakeholders and your customers understand, that where you're headed, why you're doing this, and who you are. For the case of both, they did a blog post. They had several articles, on different platforms. I saw an article on Invest Estonia. I saw an article on TechCrunch. So they communicated it widely. They even had their own blogs as well, posting it to ensure that they communicate this effectively so their stakeholders understand that this is the change we are making, that Taxify is now both. And then when you talk about implementation and rollout, of course, you roll out the new brand, either the refresh or the rebrand across all touch points, including physical and digital. And then you monitor the implementation as well of the process to ensure consistency. And that's very key and very important for you as a brand to do. And then, so for sustainability and evolution, you ensure that the brand remains relevant and adaptive over time, and you plan for ongoing brand management. So you keep the brand in a position where you keep evolving it, you keep growing it, you keep ensuring that you manage it. You don't just let it be. You ensure that it spans, its purpose, and it never goes into extension, but it stays relevant in the market. So let me quickly run through the pros and cons. I think that will be the last. So basically, so for a refresh, some of the pros are the fact that it keeps the brand updated. I've given several examples of that. It gives a positive signal to customers that the brand is evolving and not static. It preserves the equity. You can retain some of the brand's equity and recognition that the current brand has built over time, and that is still very helpful for your brand. And then it's also cost effective. I gave an example of the case of the website and the collateral, where you don't necessarily have to do total change in your layout. You could make some updates here and there, and it's less impactful, in terms of the cost. But then the con of a refresh is, it's the transformation is limited, so it may not fully leverage, the potential of a fresh start, a full brand can offer. But then, when the reason why I've had to state this out is, sometimes people really want to make some really dramatic change, but then they start to look at how they can merge what they currently have to accommodate that, and that will not be reasonable. So if you find yourself in a position, that's why I have to highlight certain points. When you find yourself in a position where you realize that, these are the key things you want to change. There are key things when you want to make changes to in your brand. You can't consider that a refresh anymore. Then you have to look at a rebrand. And if you want to still make those key changes, and then you still want to go with the approach of a refresh, then you're going to have a very distorted brand that will just, lead you into total chaos. So it's important to know that. And then for a pros of a rebrand, basically gives you a fresh start. So I talked about, both. A good example would be the fact that they wanted to switch from combustion engine, having themselves expanding into the broader aspect of transportation and trying to capture where they're headed in terms of, going green, in terms of energy, conservation. I think that was a good opportunity for them to leverage. They could have easily just started boats and without talking anything about that. But I think that was an opportunity, they saw as maybe a lapse they could actually capture in the new brand they are trying to create. So that's one opportunity it is. And the same thing with Airbnb. Basically when they did the rebrand as well, it also gave them room as well to basically start afresh, because in that case, it was more or less like recapturing the brand to actually capture its core essence, more or less missing the mark initially. And that gave them an opportunity to start afresh. Also it marks, the brand, as it makes a differentiator in the marketplace. When you have the opportunity to rebrand, especially when you've had experiences in the market, it's easier to understand the differentiator. Then again, the stuff I talked about, Airbnb, where belonging anywhere basically is that market differentiator they had. That's what they've communicated over the years that made them outstanding and globally recognized. But the cons are the fact that um, every brand is cost intensive, because you have to change a whole lot. So it's cost intensive, but it's worth it when done appropriately. Then, of course, there's the risk of losing equity. Why I would only state this out is because a lot of times, people pay, I'll say businesses pay less attention to this. So you don't feel you have a very good strategy and you have very good, a better looking identity, and that's enough for your brand to be successful. That would not always be enough for your brand to be successful. You have to ensure you to manage the communication process, the communication rollout. You have to manage the process of implementation effectively. If you don't manage these processes effectively, if you don't first of all start from ensuring that there's a need for this and ensuring that you've crafted the process appropriately, that's the first problem. But when you've gotten everything in terms of your strategy development down to your visual identity, when you want to roll out, you also have to ensure you have everything in place as well. You're communicating to the right people. They are aware, they have every information they need. You're putting every information out there necessary for this. Because when you don't do this effectively, that's when your equity starts, being affected. But when you can do this effectively, and people understand that, okay, this is the brand, Taxify is now both, and okay, this is Airbnb. It's no longer about bookings anymore. Airbnb is about people. See, when you start communicating these things clearly, then it sticks and the customer understand that this is where you're headed, and yeah, so that's it about that. So, and then in conclusion, so all I'll say here is, I'll say, the path to navigation, it's dynamic, and it's strategic, It requires deep understanding of the organization goals, your marketplace, and needs and preferences of your audience, like I've stated. So if you don't have these things in place, if you don't pay attention to this, I mean, it's not going to be or it's not going to be a walk in the park as you would think. I'd given at least one failure. I didn't want to dwell much on the failure. I want to dwell on the success, but it's something that when you're strategic about, you can see the case of Airbnb and how successful it made them. That rebrand was actually what really gave them the recognition they have today. And it's very important. It also boosted their bottom line and increased their valuation. So it's important to understand how effective branding can eventually translate effectively as well, into the finances of the company. But both a brand and a refresh, they have their merits, and the choice between, these hinges on your unique circumstances and your objectives. So don't do this because other people are doing it. Take time, assess your brand, do your proper research, ensure you have a need for it. If you have a need for a refresh, then you go for that. If you have a need for a rebrand, then you go for that. So don't just do things just because others are doing it. And then don't just look at your budget as a company. My advice would be, if you really need a rebrand, then maybe take your time, you plan for it, you take your time and execute it. Don't just rush into it and then you come up with something crappy that will eventually ruin, a multi-million naira company you've built over the years, or a reputation you've sweated over the years to build. So take your time and execute it, because your brand is a valuable asset. And with the right strategy, you can continue to thrive in an ever-changing business landscape. And yeah, and with that comes to the end of my training. So if you have any question, any feedback, that would be a good time to take that. Thank you, everyone, so far.
Thank you, David. This was great. Any questions, guys?
So, David, I want to ask, you know, I don't know if a rebrand could be as little as changing the look of social media posts and just advertisement materials and the likes. Would we call that a rebrand as well? A refresh rather. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. So you're saying changing the look and feel of social media posts?
Yeah, like just materials online, publication
Okay, so
materials
yeah, so
alone.
basically, okay, so that's what I pointed out. So when you're changing, so let's give an example, so our social media, for instance, we've changed the way we designed it over time, though it has been actually seen for a while now. So, but that's just a good example of like, I would say a part of your brand refresh process. So understand that, the refresh is not just a one-off thing. First of all, you need to understand that branding is a constant process you engage with while your brand, is in existence. And what we are looking at here on the broader terms is, the evolution of your brand. So that's why when I started the session, I tried to explain, what brand evolution is. Every intentional change you make on the brand through the life cycle. And under that evolution, there's what is called a refresh and there's what is called a rebrand. You see, so when you're making subtle changes, like you've mentioned, you're making subtle changes in terms of, okay, maybe we want to look a bit more funky on our social media. We want to change our layout style. We want to change, a bit of the copy. We want to reintroduce certain images. Maybe we need images of a certain style now on our pages. You're not really affecting your brand's vision. You're not really affecting your brand's mission. You're making these changes because of designs are evolving. When designs used to have a lot of shadows and bevels. That was taken off. There were no shadows and no bevels. If you were a brand existing within that time, you have to update your material. Design trends are changing. The way layouts used to be, 10 years ago are not the same. So when you keep making those minor changes, even within the same trends, if you say, okay, for this year, we want to change the way we look on our social media, and for next year, we want to change the way we look on our social media. As long as it's not affecting your engagement as a brand, it's fine. And in that case, as long as the brand's core essence is still being maintained, so that will be considered a refresh under the evolution of the brand. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Mine is not a question, but to thank David for this session. It's quite insightful. I've had an in-depth understanding of a refresh and a rebrand, especially as it relates to the project we've just had together for one of our clients. So well done, David. It was quite expository. I celebrate you.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So I don't know if
David, I
anyone
have
else.
a question. I know that we are running out of time, but I just have a question. I will be very quick with it, even though it's scattered in my head. So at a point where a brand has decided that they want to rebrand, is it advisable to move aspects of their brand, like from the old side into the new, to avoid the risk of just them becoming the same people with a new face? Is there a limit, or what do you advise that they move, and what
Okay, so there's a concept. Okay, so there's a concept I've skipped out. I knew someone was going to answer this question. Or someone was going to ask something related to this, and I skipped out that session, but then I introduced it, in my first part, but I didn't talk much about it. So in the case of Dunkin', for instance, so Dunkin' is, they retained their visuals, they retained every other thing they were known for visually, but then when you understand that they are moving from, rather than like a pastry based organization to moving towards a beverage-led, fast food chain. That's what they're moving into. So when you read about, the article on Donkey, maybe I'll share a bit from, I'll share one from CNBC and also from Business Insider. So over time, what they did was also to start communicating, this new line, they're venturing into communicating new partnerships, communicating, their new lifestyle brand. So what Dunkin' basically did is a rebrand, but that is considered a partial rebrand. So I didn't talk about the concept of a partial rebrand. So, but there is your brand refresh, there's a partial rebrand, and there's the total rebrand. So in the case where you can actually, where you want to actually maintain certain key elements of your brand, but you're still making a significant change. You want to maintain your visuals, for instance, because that has equity, but maybe you want to drop certain elements of your name. Another quick example I can give was HBO Max. So HBO Max, there are a lot of acquisition around HBO Max that involve Discovery, Warner Bros, and so on. And just this year, they had a rebrand from HBO Max to just Max. And then when you look at the identity system, it still has the name Max, which is still recognizable. And then the O from HBO being reflected in the A. And then the Shield Max from Warner Bros being reflected, being incorporated into the M and the X. So they created that new brand, maintaining the name Max. And there wasn't a full transformation in terms of the name. They only just took out HBO, but then the elements from the O reflects on the A, and then they incorporated subtle elements that if you're not shown, you will not figure out from other, organizations that are now part of the, the Max brand at the moment. And then they made changes in the color, but they retain certain elements. So in that case, it's a partial rebrand, and it's okay, but it has to be done strategically where it's not confusing and where it's not eventually stale. So if it is done appropriately, where the visuals are being tweaked in very minor ways, where you, for instance, in the case of Dunkin', you take out the donuts and you retain the name Dunkin', riding on the fact that this has already been communicated over the years, the American runs on Dunkin', but then you're changing your strategy. Your strategy may not always be transformative as the case of Bolt, as the case of Airbnb. So your strategy might still be within the line of your industry, within still the line of you can still toe the path you have, but then you're making very key significant change. So the change is really about, for a rebrand and a refresh, is really about, the shift in strategy, primarily the cases of acquisition and the shift in strategy. That's why I had to point out those two: shift in strategies, shift in narrative. So you could decide to maintain certain elements. Airbnb, they maintained their name, they didn't change the name, but they had to change the logo because the logo they previously had no meaning, had no context, we captured nothing, but the new logo, they nicknamed the Bello. If you look at the logo, it captures virtually every essence of belonging anywhere they are trying to sell, and then they try to incorporate friendly colors, image styles to represent that, but then they maintain the name Airbnb. They didn't change that because that's still core to them. But then in that case, it's a rebrand, but then you can still say to an extent, I wouldn't want to call that of Airbnb a partial rebrand. That's a total rebrand because it was an overhaul. But in a case like Dunkin', you could call that a partial rebrand because basically the visuals were maintained. Analysis I saw on either Inside on CNBC suggested that the brand wasn't actually easily even identified that such change has been made. But more or less, the shift in strategy is what is actually key, as a matter of fact, in rebrand, rather than even the visuals in terms of the appearance. It's the shift in strategy, the shift in direction. That's actually what's key. So I don't know if that helped, that gave more light to answer your question. Sorry.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you very much.
You.
That was very.
All right. Thank you. So I don't know if there's anyone else with a question or a comment.
Sorry, this is the last one, a quick one. So you mentioned Rolls-Royce rebranding, and you wasn't Pentagram you mentioned.
Refreshing. Yeah, that's Pentagram.
Okay, thank you.
So you can look up Pentagram, for the case study on the Rolls-Royce. So if that's all, I think that will be all for the session today. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you for the time. You have a lovely